Where is wisdom? Well, hopefully you're going to find it on this podcast. I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Today it's Dino Buddies chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs for some reason. They're actually good. And another thing, I always get to the point. Well, it's Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and next week we have a rendezvous with Isaiah. So before I start talking about this, let's think a little bit about wisdom. In the Hebrew Bible, these Proverbs and Ecclesiastes come under the section of the wisdom books. So first of all, what is wisdom? President Russell M. Nelson gave a talk about wisdom back in the early 90s, so I put a link to it. I put a bunch of my show notes and links in the comments below section for you can click on it to make sure I'm not off base on anything I'm teaching. So what is wisdom? Well, it's a gift of the Spirit. And it's interesting because we have a distinction between the world's wisdom and I'm sorry, get a little bit off topic with there. So wisdom's a gift of the Spirit, and it's something that we always see it as something that's higher than knowledge. But that's an interesting question to think about. So I'm just not giving you a spoon-fed answer. Let me follow my outline. The second thing is making a distinction between wisdom and knowledge. When you read the scriptures, they have wisdom as a gift of the Spirit, but also knowledge as a gift of the Spirit. Plus teaching wisdom and teaching knowledge are also different. So 4 different gifts of the Spirit. And think about, why do we have this distinction between knowledge and wisdom, and distinction between being able to teach knowledge and wisdom versus having knowledge and wisdom? These are really interesting distinctions. Now, they're not really elaborated on, but there's something to think about as you go through life and you observe them. You'll see why we have this distinction. For example, what's the difference between Papa Smurf and Brainy Smurf? What's the difference between Hermione Granger and Dumbledore? Who's wise and who's knowledgeable? You get the idea from those two really concrete examples. And as you read the scriptures, you can actually have better examples between knowledge and wisdom, and who's operating under a paradigm of either. So another distinction to make is the world's wisdom versus heavenly wisdom. And like I said, I was getting a little bit ahead of myself. This is the Expository Dictionary of the Bible Words, published by Mr. Richards. And this is what he has to say. The concept of wisdom is an important one. It may be particularly important for us in our technological society, where we place a strong emphasis on knowledge. The basic word group expressing the idea of wisdom includes Hākam, and cognates Hokmah, and Hākam, if I'm pronouncing those right. Together they occur in the Testament over 300 times. Hākam, it expresses a person's approach to life. Wisdom is to master life's challenges and can be found only in one's relationship with God. The Hebrew view is practical and focus. Wisdom is expressed in godly living. Now, contrast that from what we get from the Greeks. Here's Dialogues of Plato, Marcus Aurelius Meditations. Now, I'm not saying these books are bad, but you have to understand the difference between the Greek rational approach to wisdom and the spiritual approach to wisdom that we get from the Hebrews, because it's an important distinction to keep. So with all that, let's jump into the 2 books. This should be a nice quick one. It's not the complex one like we had last week with reading Psalms 119. So Proverbs. So it's a series of aphorisms, and each verse of Proverbs is like opening up a fortune cookie. Each verse is a profound statement, and that's one of the problems, is that we sometimes read through the book of Proverbs a little too quickly. You need to stop and slow down and read it as a verse by verse, sort of a caterpillar tread type approach. Another thing to understand is that there's each Proverbs is done in a parallel format, where wisdom is such, but folly is the other thing. And that's the contrast, wisdom versus folly, done in parallel formats. You ever notice the book of Proverbs is 31 chapters long? What that means is that to read it slowly, you can read a chapter a day over the course of one of the longer months we have, 31-day month, and it'll help you understand what's going on. Plus, repeated readings help out. So the book of Proverbs, it's pedagogical. It's for teaching youth, as you read from the premise, teaching children to understand wisdom. Deals with business transaction and finance. And you hear like Dave Ramsey quotes from the book of Proverbs, borrower is slave to the lender. It's really geared towards a father teaching his son wisdom as you read from the introductory passages. But at the end of it, there's the famous Proverbs 31 woman. And women sometimes feel like they're ignored in the scriptures. Well, you have section 25, the book of Ruth and Esther. Then you have the other heroic woman in the Bible, Eve, Mary, Deborah. And then you have the idealized Proverbs 31 woman. And we kind of have to take that and for the sisters to study that, to understand, use that as a life post as opposed to worldly wisdom or the folly of the world, excuse me. Okay, that's the book of Proverbs, and get to the point format. Next one is Ecclesiastes. And we're famous, this is a little bit famous for chapter 3, which was made into a song by Mr. Seeger, and later covered by the Byrds, and it went to number 1 in the 1960s, and also was quoted in the original version of Footloose. So we're sort of familiar with part of it at least, and I'll get to that a little bit later. It's possibly Solomon wrote this, and as you read it, has the expression under the sun, and sometimes we don't like it because there's sort of a futility about it. This is a message of Ecclesiastes. Life is a rat race, and you're on the hamster wheel. And if you're addicted to plastic smile syndrome, you just don't like that. Compare that to with the book of Lamentations later on in the Bible written by Jeremiah. There's the roughness and density of life that C.S. Lewis talked about that we're sometimes missing, that we want to be optimistic or happy, and that's not the message of the Old Testament, is that these negative or sometimes darker feelings are actually appropriate, and it gives you more of a well-balanced approach to life. That's okay to feel sad if you had a relative died with COVID-19. That if you've been unemployed or do that's actually an appropriate feeling, and to walk around with a plastic smile, that's not healthy, that's not right, and that's not what God wants you to do. So you may want to read the end of this. That's where it has the summation of the matter. So you have to read the entire book, and we have the selected chapters that we read, but read the first chapter and the last chapter, which is how you should read a book, a nonfiction book anyway, is just to get the sum up of the matter, and then you read all the stuff in the middle that rounds out the discussion. Now, Ecclesiastes 3. That's an interesting one. It deals with to everything there's a time and a purpose under heaven, and talks about these different phases of life. Dallin H. Oakes gave a talk called Timing. So I put a link to that in the notes below. And that's a good thing. Another thing that has to deal with context and situation is that sometimes we make decisions. You just don't have this one-size-fits-all approach. A number of years ago, back in the 60s, there's a philosopher came up with this idea called situation ethics, where everything just reduces itself to context, and so you make decisions. And of course, you see the problems with that. Is it short-term context? Is it long-term context? It's a problematic philosophy where everything is context, but it's certainly when you're making a decision, you put context in the as a factor in the decision. For example, Thomas Aquinas. So he said that when you make an ethical decision, you have 3 factors. You have the nature of the act, the intent, and also the context. And with sometimes we forget the context. It's like a person who's in their 20s or in their 50s and is still acting like a 20-year-old, or a person in their later in life, they're just not acting age appropriate. Having a life plan that worked in the 20s doesn't work in the 30s and then the 40s. So that's something to keep in mind. Is are you acting appropriately for the phase in life that you're in? You have some other questions too about time to kill, time to cast away stones, time to refrain from embracing. There's a question about just war theory. Now, you can't get just war theory from one verse in Ecclesiastes. You have to read the Book of Mormon to get the idea rounded out. But it's in there that some of these ideas that the world has to offer about radical pacifism, that's not what you're reading in the scriptures. It's really different. So these are wisdom books, so it takes a while to mull things over, and it's going to take repeated readings to understand this. Like I said, you have Plato has his version of wisdom, Marcus Aurelius, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam's another one that's a little bit depressing, where you have the futility of life, and make sure we're making a distinction between worldly wisdom and then the spiritual wisdom. The next thing is in the Book of Solomon. Remember how, or in the Book of Kings, I think. Well, it doesn't matter. Okay, in the Bible, that Solomon asked for wisdom as his gift, and I made the point that wisdom's not the greatest thing you have. The greatest thing you can have is charity, as Paul points out in 1 Corinthians 13. And keep this in mind as you're reading these things, that you can act knowledgeably and you can act wisely, but not act charitably, and it creates problems. That charity is the greatest thing that you can aspire for, because charity transcends wisdom. It embraces wisdom, but goes beyond that. So as important as wisdom is, charity is the greater thing to have. Now we're at the Christ quotient. 1, wisdom is how you get through life. As you read the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, you're getting a good roadmap and important tips and pointers about how to govern your life. The second thing is wisdom's an attribute of Christ. So thirdly, the more wisdom you have, the more Christ-like you will be. And being Christ-like, that's the point. Thank you. And rendezvous with Isaiah next week.